At my son's wedding reception, my husband whispered, "I'm done pretending," and walked away with his secretary. As the best man, I stepped to the microphone, smiled at the stunned crowd, and said, "Speaking of love stories, my husband also found his just like our son." His face went white. The chaos that followed destroyed him completely, and I never raised my voice. Those words slipped from my lips like silk-wrapped steel, amplified through the crystal-clear sound system of the Riverside Manor ballroom.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The champagne flute in my hand caught the warm glow of the Edison bulb chandeliers as I maintained perfect eye contact with my husband Kirk across the elegantly decorated reception hall. I hadn't planned to say it quite like that. Not yet. But watching his confident stride toward the exit with Shania, his 28-year-old executive assistant, gave me a clarity I hadn't anticipated. Just 45 minutes earlier, I'd been adjusting my navy blue blazer in the bridal suite's full-length mirror, checking that my best man boutonniere was perfectly positioned. The irony wasn't lost on me. At 52, I was probably the only mother in Chicago history to serve as her son's best man. But Anthony had insisted, his warm brown eyes serious as he'd made the request 6 months ago. "Mom, you've been my rock through everything," he'd said, his voice still carrying traces of the uncertainty that had plagued him during those dark teenage years. "Dad was never there when I needed him most. You were. You're the person I trust completely, and I want you standing beside me when I marry Evie." The memory of his depression still made my chest tighten. 3 years of watching my brilliant, sensitive boy struggle with anxiety so severe he'd barely left his room. 3 years of me driving him to therapy appointments, sitting with him during panic attacks, researching treatment options while Kirk dismissed it all as teenage drama and buried himself deeper into his work at Coleman & Associates Financial Consulting. "He just needs to toughen up," Kirk had said repeatedly, never bothering to attend a single therapy session or school meeting. "Stop babying him, Harriet. The real world doesn't coddle people." But I'd seen what the real world could do to someone as gentle and thoughtful as Anthony, so I'd become his advocate, his protector, his unwavering support system. When he'd discovered his passion for architectural restoration during his junior year, sparked by our weekend visits to historic buildings around Illinois, I'd been the one cheering from the sidelines as his confidence slowly rebuilt itself. Now at 26, Anthony Watson was a successful preservation architect with his own small firm, married to Evie Coleman, a brilliant environmental lawyer who adored his sensitive nature. The wedding ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral had been perfect, intimate, meaningful, filled with the kind of love that made even cynical guests tear up. Kirk had walked Anthony down the aisle with me, playing the proud father role flawlessly. He'd smiled for photos, shaken hands with Evie's family, and delivered a perfectly adequate father-of-the-groom toast during cocktail hour. To any observer, we looked like the picture of a successful, long-married couple celebrating our son's happiness. But I'd noticed the subtle signs throughout the day, the way Kirk's eyes kept drifting to Shania, who'd somehow secured an invitation as his +1 for business networking, the way he'd positioned himself near her during group photos, his hand lingering a moment too long on her lower back. The secretive smile they'd shared when they thought no one was watching. 23 years of marriage had taught me to read Kirk's tells, the slight adjustment of his tie when he was nervous, the way he checked his phone obsessively when he was planning something, the particular cologne he wore only when he was trying to impress someone new, the same scent that had been clinging to his shirts for the past 8 months. During the cocktail hour, while I'd been making small talk with Evie's grandmother and ensuring Anthony's college friends felt included, I'd watched my husband's performance with growing detachment. He was already mentally checked out, going through the motions until he could make his escape. The moment came during the traditional best man speech segment of the reception. I'd been planning to deliver the heartfelt remarks I'd been crafting for weeks, stories about Anthony's resilience, his artistic vision, his capacity for love. Instead, I found myself holding the microphone as Kirk appeared beside me, his expression tense but determined. "I need to leave," he'd whispered, not even bothering to lower his voice enough to avoid the nearby tables. "There's an emergency at the office. Shania and I have to handle a client crisis." The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. On a Saturday evening, during his son's wedding reception, with his secretary who'd been drinking champagne and laughing loudly for the past 2 hours. "An emergency," I'd repeated flatly, watching Shania hover near the exit in her inappropriately tight red dress, car keys already in her manicured hand. "Yes, I'm sorry about the timing, but business comes first. You understand." Kirk's tone carried that patronizing edge he'd perfected over the years, the one that suggested I was being unreasonable for expecting basic consideration. That's when Anthony appeared at my shoulder, having noticed the tension from across the room. My son, perceptive as always, took one look at his father's barely concealed impatience and Shania's obvious positioning by the door. "Really, Dad?" Anthony's voice was quiet but carried clearly in the momentary lull between songs. "On my wedding day?" Kirk's jaw tightened. "Sometimes adult responsibilities take precedence over parties, son. Maybe when you're older you'll understand how the real world works." The casual dismissal, the condescending tone, the complete disregard for this momentous day in Anthony's life, it crystallized everything wrong with our marriage in a single moment. But it was Anthony's response that gave me permission to stop protecting Kirk's reputation. My son looked at me with those same warm brown eyes that had trusted me through his darkest periods, and I saw not the vulnerable teenager who'd needed my protection, but a strong, confident man who'd grown tired of watching his father hurt the people he loved. "Mom," Anthony said softly, his hand finding mine on the microphone, "tell them the truth. All of it. He doesn't deserve your protection anymore." The wedding guests had begun to notice the tension, conversations quieting as heads turned toward our little drama unfolding near the head table. Evie stood frozen by the cake table, her new husband's pain reflected in her concerned expression.
Kirk shifted uncomfortably, finally sensing that his usual script wasn't playing out as expected. "Harriet, don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. I'll be back later to help clean up." That's when I stepped fully to the microphone, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system as I looked directly at my husband's increasingly pale face. "You forgot one thing," I said, my tone conversational, but somehow final. Kirk's confident stride toward the exit faltered. For the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. He had no idea what was coming next. The uncertainty in Kirk's eyes lasted only a moment before his practiced composure reasserted itself. He forced that familiar condescending smile, the one he used during difficult client meetings when he needed to project control he didn't actually possess. "Harriet, we can discuss whatever's bothering you later," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume for the nearby tables to hear. "This isn't the time or place for one of your episodes." Episodes. The word hung in the air like a slap. 23 years of marriage, and he still dismissed my legitimate concerns as emotional instability. The same tactic he'd used when I'd questioned his late nights, his weekend business trips, his sudden need for a younger, more attractive assistant, despite having a perfectly competent office manager for 15 years. I felt Anthony's hand tighten supportively on my shoulder, and something shifted inside me, a door closing on decades of making excuses for Kirk's behavior, of protecting his reputation at the expense of my own dignity. "You're absolutely right," I said. Into the microphone, my voice steady and warm. "This isn't the time for episodes, it's time for truth." The reception hall had grown noticeably quieter, guests sensing drama but not yet understanding its scope. Evie moved closer to Anthony, her lawyer instincts clearly picking up on the tension. Near the exit, Shania fidgeted with her clutch purse, her confident demeanor beginning to crack as she realized their smooth escape was being delayed. I turned slightly to address the room, my training from years of PTA presentations and church committee meetings serving me well. Project confidence, make eye contact, speak clearly, skills I'd developed while Kirk was absent from every school function and community event that had shaped our son's childhood. "For those who don't know me well," I continued,
noting how Kirk's face was beginning to flush red around his collar. "I'm Harriet Watson, mother of the groom, and tonight's best man."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It's an unconventional choice, I know, but Anthony and I have always had an unconventional relationship. A few warm chuckles rippled through the crowd. Anthony's college friends smiled knowingly. They'd heard stories about the mother who'd attended every architecture competition, every therapy session, every late-night crisis that had shaped their friend into the remarkable man he'd become. When Anthony was 16, I said, my voice growing stronger, he went through a very difficult period. Clinical depression, anxiety attacks, the kind of struggle that requires unwavering family support. My eyes found Kirk's across the room. I spent 3 years learning everything I could about mental health, driving to appointments, sitting in waiting rooms, advocating for treatments that would help my son heal. The room had gone completely silent now, even the catering staff pausing their cleanup to listen. I could see understanding beginning to dawn on some faces. Anthony's depression wasn't a secret among his close friends, but many of Kirk's business associates had never heard the full story. During those 3 years, I continued, never breaking eye contact with my husband. Kirk told me repeatedly that I was enabling weakness, that Anthony just needed to toughen up and face the real world. He never attended a single therapy session, never read a single article I shared about adolescent mental health, never offered anything more constructive than criticism. Kirk's mouth opened as if to protest, but I pressed on, my voice carrying clearly through the excellent acoustics of the Riverside Manor ballroom. Instead, he threw himself into his work. Longer hours, more business trips, new projects that required his constant attention. For years I told myself he was working hard to provide for our family, to give Anthony opportunities. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle. I was wrong. Near the exit, Shania had gone very still, her earlier impatience replaced by something approaching panic. She was smart enough to recognize that her comfortable position as Kirk's secret was about to be dramatically exposed. "The truth is," I said, my voice growing warmer as I looked at Anthony and Evie, during the years when our son needed his father most, Kirk was building a different kind of relationship. Not with clients, not with business opportunities, but with someone who made him feel young and important and free from the messy realities of family responsibility. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Kirk had gone completely pale now, his confident posture crumbling as he realized the scope of what was happening. This wasn't a private marital disagreement that could be smoothed over later. This was a public reckoning. "Shania Williams," I said, turning to look directly at the young woman by the door, "has been my husband's executive assistant for 8 months. In that time, she's helped him with far more than filing and scheduling. She's helped him remember what it feels like to have someone look at him with admiration instead of disappointment." Shania's face had drained of all color, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide her mortification. Several guests had turned to stare at her, recognition dawning as they processed the implications of what they were hearing. "I don't blame her entirely," I continued, my tone remaining remarkably even. "She's young, ambitious, and Kirk can be very charming when he wants something. She probably believes he's going to leave me for her, start fresh with someone who appreciates his success without knowing the cost of achieving it." Kirk finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands raised in a gesture that might have been placating or defensive. "Harriet, stop this right now. You're embarrassing yourself and ruining Anthony's wedding." "No," Anthony said clearly, his voice carrying without amplification. "She's telling the truth at my wedding. There's a difference." The support in my son's voice gave me the strength to continue, to push past the familiar patterns of backing down when Kirk's authority was challenged. "The thing about truth," I said, into the microphone, "is that it has a way of revealing itself eventually. Tonight seemed like the perfect time." Kirk's confident facade was completely gone now, replaced by something approaching desperation, as he realized his carefully constructed double life was collapsing in the most public way possible. He had no idea how much more I knew. The desperation in Kirk's eyes was almost satisfying, but I wasn't finished. 23 years of marriage had taught me that my husband's greatest weakness was his need to control narratives, to spin situations in his favor. He was already calculating, I could see it, how to minimize the damage, how to paint me as an unstable wife having a breakdown at her son's wedding. "I know what you're thinking," I said into the microphone, my voice carrying the gentle confidence I'd learned from years of diffusing Anthony's panic attacks. This poor woman, finally snapping under the pressure of her husband's success, having an emotional breakdown at the worst possible moment. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, probably thinking exactly that. Kirk's business partners from Coleman and Associates were whispering among themselves, their wives shooting sympathetic glances in my direction that made it clear they'd seen this script before, the overlooked spouse finally losing composure in public. "But here's what makes tonight different," I continued, noting how Shania had backed closer to the exit, her hand now firmly on the door handle. "I'm not having a breakdown, I'm having a breakthrough." Anthony squeezed my shoulder encouragingly. My son understood better than anyone how carefully I'd learned to navigate Kirk's manipulations, how strategic my responses had become over the years of protecting both Anthony's emotional well-being and our family's public image. You see, for the past 8 months, while Kirk has been discovering his new lease on life with Shania, I've been having my own journey of discovery. I turned slightly to address the room more fully, my 20 years of volunteer work having taught me how to hold an audience's attention. Did you know that in Illinois, financial infidelity is considered grounds for divorce, not just the emotional betrayal, but the actual monetary deception that often accompanies affairs? Kirk's face went from pale to gray. Near the gift table, I noticed his business partner Charles Lester suddenly paying very close attention, his expression shifting from social discomfort to professional concern. "I learned so many fascinating things during my research," I said conversationally. "For instance, when someone starts redirecting marital assets to fund a relationship outside the marriage, expensive dinners, weekend trips, jewelry purchases, those expenditures become very relevant in divorce proceedings." The room had gone completely silent, except for the soft jazz music still playing from the sound system. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, trays frozen in their hands as they absorbed the implications of what they were hearing. "Kirk, remember that weekend business conference in Milwaukee back in February?" I asked, my tone bright and interested. "The one where you and Shania had to work so closely on the Henderson account presentation." My husband's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Behind him, I could see Shania's eyes darting between Kirk and the exit, clearly calculating whether she could slip out unnoticed. "I found the hotel receipts," I continued pleasantly. The wine service charge for the suite was particularly interesting, along with the charges for couples spa treatments. Very thorough research for a business presentation. Charles Lester's wife put her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Around the room, conversations had completely ceased as guests processed the detailed nature of my revelations. This wasn't vague accusation, this was documented evidence being presented with courtroom precision. "Mom," Anthony said quietly, his voice barely audible but somehow carrying in the silence, "tell them about the account." Kirk's head snapped toward our son, confusion and growing panic replacing his earlier confidence. "What account?" I smiled at Anthony, remembering the conversation we'd had 3 weeks ago when he'd accidentally discovered what I'd been planning. My perceptive son had noticed the changes in my behavior, the subtle confidence, the secret meetings with my attorney, the way I'd stopped trying to manage Kirk's moods and appearances. The interesting thing about financial infidelity, I said into the microphone, is that it works both ways. While Kirk was redirecting our joint assets to fund his relationship with Shania, I was making my own financial discoveries. I could see several of Kirk's colleagues exchanging glances, the business implications beginning to dawn on them. Charles Lester looked particularly concerned, probably remembering the various joint accounts and shared investments that connected their firm's operations. For 23 years, I handled all our household finances while Kirk focused on his career. I explained to the increasingly attentive audience. I balanced checkbooks, managed investments, filed taxes, tracked expenses. Kirk trusted me completely with our financial life, because he was too busy with more important things. Near the exit, Shania had gone completely still, her earlier confidence replaced by something approaching terror as she began to understand that her comfortable position was built on shifting sand. What I discovered during my research was fascinating, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. Did you know that the Watson Family Trust, the one Kirk's grandfather established in 1952, lists me as the primary beneficiary after Kirk? Not joint beneficiary, primary. Kirk's face had gone from gray to green. That's not you can't. I can. I said simply. I already have. As of 3 weeks ago, I've exercised my rights as primary beneficiary to freeze all trust distributions pending a complete financial audit. The implications hit the room like a physical wave. Kirk's lifestyle, his business investments, his ability to maintain his current standard of living, all of it was connected to that trust fund. Several guests who knew him well began to look at him with new understanding, perhaps finally grasping how a mid-level financial consultant could afford such an expensive lifestyle. But that's not even the best part, I said, glancing at Anthony, who nodded encouragingly. The truly interesting discovery was learning about the Coleman and Associates operating agreement, the one that requires all partners to maintain certain ethical standards and financial transparency. Charles Lester had gone very pale. As managing partner, he would understand immediately what I was implying, that Kirk's undisclosed financial irregularities could jeopardize the entire firm's licensing and reputation.
Kirk finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands outstretched in a gesture of desperate appeal. Harriet, please. We can work this out privately. Don't destroy everything we've built. We didn't build anything, I replied calmly. I built a foundation while you built an illusion. The truth was finally out, and Kirk was beginning to realize just how completely his world was about to collapse. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Even the soft jazz had stopped, the musicians apparently as captivated by the unfolding drama as everyone else. Kirk stood frozen near the head table, his face cycling through emotions I'd rarely seen from him, genuine fear being the most prominent. 23 years, I said, my voice carrying easily through the acoustically perfect room. That's how long I've been the invisible partner in our marriage. The one who managed every detail of our domestic life while Kirk built his professional reputation. The one who sacrificed career opportunities so he could travel freely for business. The one who raised our son essentially alone, while being told I was just a housewife. I could see nods of recognition from several of the women in the audience, particularly the wives of Kirk's business associates. They understood the familiar dynamic, the high-achieving husband, and the supportive wife whose contributions were systematically minimized and forgotten. But being invisible has its advantages, I continued, noting how Shania had begun edging closer to the exit again, clearly hoping to escape before the situation deteriorated further. When people don't really see you, they tend to underestimate what you're capable of understanding.
what you're capable of discovering. Kirk's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Behind him, I could see Charles Lester having an urgent whispered conversation with his wife, both of them shooting increasingly alarmed glances in our direction. The business implications of what I was revealing were becoming clearer by the moment. For instance, I said pleasantly, Kirk probably thinks I have no idea how business partnerships work, that I wouldn't understand the complexities of firm management or client relationships. After all, I'm just the wife who makes sure his shirts are pressed and his social calendar is managed. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd, but they died quickly as the tension in the room continued to build. Anthony moved closer to my side, his presence both supportive and protective. My son had inherited my ability to read situations, and he could sense that we were approaching the crescendo of revelations. What Kirk doesn't know, I continued, my voice growing stronger, is that for the past 6 months, I've been having weekly coffee meetings with Margaret Lester. Charles Lester's face went completely white. His wife Margaret, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, had been Charles's unofficial business advisor for over 30 years, the kind of partner who understood every aspect of the firm's operations despite never holding an official title. Margaret has been very educational, I said, smiling in Margaret's direction where she sat at table 4, her expression carefully neutral. She's taught me so much about partnership agreements, fiduciary responsibilities, and the kinds of financial irregularities that can trigger ethics investigations. Kirk spun around to stare at Charles, panic and betrayal warring across his features. Charles, you have to understand, whatever she's told you, I told her the truth. Margaret Lester said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent room without amplification. About the Henderson account discrepancies. About the unauthorized expense reports. About the client entertainment charges that couldn't be verified. The bombshell landed with devastating precision. Several guests gasped audibly, and I could see Kirk's remaining allies beginning to distance themselves physically, chairs scooting back from tables as if proximity might make them complicit. Margaret has been documenting irregularities in Kirk's expense reports for months, I explained to the captivated audience. The kinds of discrepancies that would be concerning in any business, but are particularly problematic for a financial consulting firm that manages client trust accounts. Kirk's knees actually buckled slightly. He grabbed the back of a chair for support, his confident businessman persona completely shattered. Near the exit, Shania had gone completely still, probably realized her romantic adventure was about to become a professional nightmare. The lavish dinners, the weekend trips, the expensive gifts, all of it charged to company accounts as client development expenses. I continued. Except the clients in question never received any services. They were phantom accounts, created to justify spending company money on personal relationships. Charles Lester stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. Kirk, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you haven't been embezzling from our firm. The word embezzling hung in the air like a death sentence. Several guests began murmuring among themselves, the social discomfort giving way to genuine shock as they processed the criminal implications of what they were hearing. I can explain everything, Kirk said desperately, his voice cracking. It was just temporary. I was going to pay it all back before anyone noticed. Before anyone noticed. I repeated, incredulous. Kirk, you've been stealing from your business partners for 8 months to fund your affair. That's not a temporary mistake. That's systematic fraud. Anthony stepped closer to the microphone, his voice calm but carrying clearly. Dad, did you really think no one would figure it out? Did you think Mom was too stupid to understand business, too trusting to investigate when things didn't add up? The pain in my son's voice was evident, and I could see it affecting several guests who knew Anthony well. This wasn't just about a marriage falling apart. This was about a father's betrayal of his family's trust and respect. Your mother has been building a case against you for months, Anthony continued, his words measured and deliberate. Financial records, documentation, witness statements. She's been 3 steps ahead of you the entire time. Kirk's face crumpled as the full scope of his situation became clear. His marriage was over, his business partnership was destroyed, his reputation was in ruins, and his son, the one person whose respect might have sustained him, was looking at him with undisguised contempt. The really tragic part, I said softly into the microphone, is that if you had just asked for a divorce honestly, I might have been willing to work out something reasonable. But you chose deception, theft and betrayal instead. Kirk looked around the room desperately, seeking some ally or escape route, but finding only shocked faces and disappointed stares. He was completely trapped, and everyone in the room knew it. The desperation in Kirk's eyes shifted to something uglier, cornered animal rage mixed with wounded pride. I'd seen this look before, usually when Anthony had challenged one of his decisions during those difficult teenage years. It was the expression of a man who had never learned to accept responsibility for his failures. "You vindictive bitch," he snarled, abandoning any pretense of public decorum. "You've been planning this for months, haven't you? Sitting in our home, smiling at me, pretending everything was fine while you plotted to destroy my life." A collective gasp swept through the room. Several women looked genuinely shocked at his language, while the men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even by Kirk's standards, attacking me publicly at our son's wedding was a new low. Anthony stepped forward, his jaw tight with anger. "Dad, that's enough." "No, it's not enough," Kirk shouted, his careful businessman facade completely gone. "Your mother has been systematically sabotaging everything I've worked for. 23 years of building a career, a reputation, a future, and she's throwing it all away because her feelings got hurt." I remained perfectly calm at the microphone, watching my husband's public meltdown with something approaching clinical detachment. This was exactly what I'd expected. When cornered, Kirk always chose attack over accountability. Her feelings got hurt. Anthony's voice carried a dangerous edge I'd rarely heard from my gentle son. "Dad, you've been stealing money and cheating on your wife. Mom didn't sabotage anything, you destroyed it yourself." Kirk whirled to face our son, his face flushed with fury. "Don't lecture me about responsibility, Anthony. I've supported this family for over 2 decades while your mother played house and enabled your weaknesses. Everything you have, everything you've achieved, comes from my hard work." The cruelty of those words, delivered at Anthony's wedding, in front of his new wife and all their friends, created a silence so profound I could hear the air conditioning humming. Even Shania looked horrified, finally understanding the true character of the man she'd been sleeping with. "Actually," I said calmly into the microphone, "that's not quite accurate." Kirk spun back toward me, his eyes wild. "What?" "Anthony's architectural firm, his education, his opportunities, very little of that came from your income, Kirk." I kept my voice level and factual, the tone I'd learned from years of dealing with school administrators and insurance companies. "It came from the Watson family trust, the same trust that's now frozen pending investigation." I could see understanding dawning on several faces in the crowd. Kirk's lifestyle, his ability to support our family's standard of living, had never actually come from his modest salary at Coleman and Associates. It had come from inherited wealth that legally belonged to both of us, but primarily to me. The college tuition, the therapy bills, the down payment on Anthony's first apartment, all of it came from trust distributions that I approved and managed. I continued, "You never actually supported our family with your earnings, Kirk. You supported your ego and your affairs. Kirk's face went from red to purple. That money is mine, my grandfather's trust. Names me as primary beneficiary, I finished. Your grandfather was very specific about that after your father's gambling problems in the 1970s. He wanted to ensure the family assets were protected by someone with better judgment. The historical context landed like another bombshell. Several older guests nodded knowingly. They remembered the Watson family scandals from decades past, the patterns of financial irresponsibility that had apparently skipped a generation before resurfacing in Kirk. Charles Lester cleared his throat loudly. Kirk, I think you need to come with me. We need to discuss this privately. There's nothing to discuss, Kirk shouted, his voice echoing off the ballroom's high ceilings. This is a setup, a conspiracy between vindictive women who can't stand to see a man succeed. The misogyny in his outburst was breathtaking. I could see several men in the audience looking genuinely disgusted, while their wives exchanged knowing glances. This was Kirk without his masks, the entitled bitter man I'd been living with for years. Evie, who had been standing quietly beside Anthony throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. Her voice was calm, but carried the authority of someone accustomed to courtroom proceedings. Mr. Watson, she said formally, you're digging yourself into a very deep legal hole right now. I'd strongly suggest you stop talking and contact an attorney. My new daughter-in-law's professional assessment seemed to snap Kirk back to partial awareness of his situation. He looked around the room, finally seeing the shocked faces, the disgust, the complete collapse of his social standing. This isn't over, he said, pointing at me with a shaking finger. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started. Actually, I replied calmly, I know exactly what I've started, and exactly how it's going to end. Kirk's threats had always worked on me before, but not tonight. Tonight, for the first time in 23 years, I held all the cards. Kirk's threats hung in the air like smoke, but I could see in his eyes that he was beginning to understand the futility of his position. 23 years of marriage had taught me to read his micro-expressions, and right now I saw something I'd never witnessed before. The dawning realization that he had no leverage left. You want to know what I've started? I asked, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's perfect acoustics. Let me paint you a picture of your immediate future. I turned slightly to address the room more fully, noting how guests were leaning forward in their seats. What had begun as a family drama was transforming into something more compelling, a masterclass in consequences delivered with surgical precision. Tomorrow morning, Charles will arrive at Coleman & Associates to find a formal audit notice from the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, I said conversationally. They'll be very interested in reviewing the Henderson account discrepancies that Margaret documented so thoroughly. Charles Lester's face had gone ashen. As managing partner, he understood that a state investigation could destroy their firm's reputation and business licenses. His eyes darted between Kirk and his wife Margaret, clearly calculating the damage control that would be required. By Tuesday, Kirk's access to all Watson family trust accounts will be formally revoked, I continued, enjoying the way my husband's confident posture crumbled with each revelation. The freeze I initiated 3 weeks ago will become permanent, pending the outcome of divorce proceedings. Kirk opened his mouth to protest, but I pressed on, 23 years of suppressed anger giving my words devastating clarity. Wednesday brings the really interesting development, I said, my tone brightening as if discussing weekend plans. That's when the Internal Revenue Service receives copies of all those fraudulent expense reports. Amazing how quickly tax evasion investigations move when the documentation is comprehensive. Several guests exchanged alarmed glances. The mention of federal tax crimes elevated this beyond simple marital discord into the realm of serious legal jeopardy. Kirk's face had gone completely gray, his earlier bravado replaced by something approaching shock. "But my personal favorite," I said, allowing myself a genuine smile, "is Thursday's surprise. That's when Shania's husband receives copies of all the hotel receipts, restaurant charges, and jewelry purchases Kirk made on company accounts." The collective gasp from the audience was audible. Near the exit, Shania Williams went completely rigid, her face draining of all color as the implications hit her. She was married, a detail Kirk had apparently failed to mention to most people, including several guests who were now staring at her with undisguised shock. "Marcus Williams is a very successful patent attorney," I explained pleasantly. "He's also apparently unaware that his wife has been conducting an affair funded by embezzled money. I imagine their upcoming divorce proceedings will be quite educational for everyone involved." Shania made a strangled sound and bolted for the exit, her high heels clicking frantically against the marble floor as she fled the ballroom. The door slammed behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. Kirk stared after his mistress, the reality of his complete isolation finally sinking in. His business partnership was destroyed, his marriage was over, his financial assets were frozen, and even his affair had collapsed under the weight of exposure. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "How did you find out about Marcus?" "Private investigators are remarkably thorough when you give them enough time and motivation," I replied. "Amazing what you can discover when you're not distracted by emotional manipulation and gaslighting." Anthony moved closer to my side, his presence both protective and supportive. "Mom hired the best investigative team in Chicago 6 months ago," he said quietly. "She's been documenting everything while you thought she was just the obedient housewife." The pride in my son's voice was unmistakable, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with vindication. Anthony understood what this moment represented, not just the end of a toxic marriage, but the emergence of a woman who had finally stopped accepting unacceptable treatment. "The really sad part," I said, into the microphone, my voice softening slightly, "is that this all could have been avoided. If you had simply asked for a divorce honestly, if you had treated me with basic respect during the process, we might have found a way to separate without destroying everything." Kirk looked around the room desperately, seeking some escape from the consequences closing in around him. But there was nowhere to run, no one left to charm or manipulate. His carefully constructed world of privilege and deception had collapsed completely. "But you chose betrayal over honesty," I continued. "Theft over integrity, cruelty over compassion. So now you get to experience what consequences actually look like." The ballroom remained silent, except for the soft sound of Kirk's labored breathing as he processed the full scope of his situation. He was utterly completely defeated, and everyone in the room knew it. The defeated look in Kirk's eyes gradually transformed into something more familiar, the cold calculation he used when closing difficult business deals. Even cornered and exposed, he was still looking for an angle, some way to minimize the damage or shift blame away from himself. "You think you're so clever," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet tone I remembered from our worst arguments. "But you've forgotten something important, Harriet. Mutual assured destruction works both ways." A chill ran through the room as guests sensed the shift in his demeanor. Even Anthony tensed beside me, recognizing the pattern from years of watching his father's manipulative tactics during family conflicts. "What are you talking about?" I asked, though something in Kirk's expression was triggering alarm bells in my mind. "Your little investigation was very thorough," Kirk said, his confidence beginning to return as he found his footing in familiar territory, intimidation through superior knowledge. "But did your private investigators happen to mention the Cayman accounts? My blood went cold. Around the room, I could see confusion on most faces, but Charles Lester had gone very pale, clearly understanding implications that others were missing. "That's right," Kirk continued, noting my reaction with satisfaction. "The offshore accounts that both our names are on. The ones that received significant transfers over the past 2 years as we've been diversifying our investment portfolio." I felt the microphone shake slightly in my hand. The Cayman accounts, I'd signed papers for them 18 months ago, trusting Kirk's explanation about tax-advantaged international investments. I'd been so focused on documenting his recent fraudulent activities that I hadn't fully investigated the earlier financial moves. "Turns out," Kirk said, his voice gaining strength as he sensed an advantage, "when the IRS starts investigating tax evasion, they get very interested in undeclared foreign accounts, especially ones with significant unreported income transfers." The room was silent, except for the sound of my heart pounding. Anthony looked confused, not understanding the financial complexities, but Charles Lester's expression confirmed my worst fears. Kirk was threatening to drag me down with him using financial arrangements I'd signed in good faith. "Joint accounts mean joint liability," Kirk explained to the audience, his tone taking on the lecturing quality he used with clients. "When one spouse commits tax fraud using shared offshore assets, both spouses can face criminal charges, even if one claims ignorance." I could feel the momentum of the evening shifting. Several guests were looking at me with new uncertainty, wondering if I was as complicit in financial crimes as I was claiming Kirk to be. The moral high ground I'd been standing on suddenly felt much less stable. "The beauty of it," Kirk continued, warming to his theme, "is that Harriet's precious investigation has created a paper trail that leads directly back to her own criminal liability. Every document she's gathered, every transaction she's traced, proves her involvement in tax evasion schemes she claims to have known nothing about." Margaret Lester cleared her throat from table 4. "Kirk, you're threatening your wife with mutual criminal prosecution at your son's wedding. Do you hear yourself?" "I'm stating facts," Kirk replied coldly. "Facts that my dear wife apparently overlooked during her months of plotting my destruction. We're married, Margaret. Everything I did with her legal knowledge and consent. Every signature, every account, every transfer, all documented and official." The calculation in his voice was chilling. This was Kirk at his most dangerous, cornered but not defeated, willing to destroy everything rather than face consequences alone. I could see him reconstructing his defense strategy in real time, transforming from sole perpetrator to victim of an equally guilty spouse. "So here's my counter-proposal," Kirk said, addressing the room but looking directly at me. "We can continue this public spectacle, and we can both spend the next 5 years in federal prison for tax evasion and fraud. Or we can handle this like civilized adults, quietly divorce with sealed records, and avoid destroying both our lives." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel Anthony's tension beside me, could see the confusion and concern on his face as he processed his father's threats. My moment of triumph was transforming into something much more complicated and dangerous. "You're willing to destroy your own wife to save yourself?" Evie asked, her lawyer's instincts clearly outraged by the ethics of Kirk's position. "I'm willing to remind her that actions have consequences," Kirk replied smoothly. "Even well-intentioned actions taken by people who thought they were smarter than everyone else." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Kirk had found his leverage after all, the possibility that my quest for justice could end with my own criminal prosecution. After 23 years of marriage, he knew exactly which buttons to push to make me doubt myself. But as I looked at Anthony's face, at the disappointment and pain in my son's eyes, I realized something important. Some things were worth the risk. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity as Kirk's threat settled over the room like a toxic cloud. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the familiar satisfaction he got from regaining control through intimidation. For 23 years this pattern had worked: threaten consequences, watch me back down, resume the status quo with him holding all the power. But something had fundamentally changed during those months of investigation and preparation. I wasn't the same woman who had signed those Cayman account papers in blind trust. I wasn't the same person who had spent decades managing Kirk's image while sacrificing my own dignity. "You're absolutely right," I said calmly into the microphone, watching surprise flicker across Kirk's features. "Actions do have consequences. And some consequences are worth accepting." Anthony moved closer to my side, his presence both supportive and questioning. I could see the worry in his eyes, the fear that his mother might be about to sacrifice herself in a way that would destroy our family more completely than Kirk's betrayals ever could. "The Cayman accounts," I continued, my voice steady and clear, "were opened 18 months ago with my signature on documents I trusted Kirk to explain honestly. I signed them believing we were making legitimate international investments to secure our retirement." I turned to address Charles Lester directly. "Charles, you were present at the meeting where Kirk first mentioned those accounts. Do you remember what he told us about their purpose?" Charles shifted uncomfortably, clearly not wanting to be drawn deeper into the confrontation, but his professional integrity won out over personal discomfort. He said they were tax-compliant diversification strategies recommended by his offshore banking contacts. "Tax-compliant," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "That's very different from what he's describing now, isn't it?" Kirk's confident expression began to waver as he realized I wasn't collapsing under his threats. Around the room, guests were following the exchange with growing understanding of the manipulation tactics at play. "The difference," I explained to the audience, "between someone who signs documents in good faith based on false information, and someone who creates those false documents to commit fraud, is the difference between being a victim and being a perpetrator." Margaret Lester nodded approvingly from her table. "Intent matters significantly in financial crime prosecution. Harriet's cooperation with investigators would be viewed very differently than Kirk's attempts to conceal evidence." I could see Kirk's strategy crumbling in real time. His threat had been based on the assumption that I would prioritize my own safety over justice, that I would choose silence over accountability. He had fundamentally misunderstood who I had become during those months of preparation. "But here's what you really forgot, Kirk," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You forgot that I've been working with federal investigators for 3 months. They know exactly what I knew and when I knew it. They have my complete cooperation and all my communications with you about those accounts." The color drained from Kirk's face as the implications hit him. If I had been cooperating with federal authorities, his threats of mutual prosecution were not just empty, they were potentially additional charges of witness intimidation. "The FBI Financial Crimes Unit has been very interested in our case," I continued, noting how several guests were now staring at Kirk with open shock. "Particularly the pattern of fraudulent documentation and spousal manipulation they've seen in other white-collar crime investigations." Anthony's hand found mine, squeezing gently. "Mom, you've been working with the FBI. For 3 months," I confirmed, looking at my son with pride and determination. "Ever since I discovered the full scope of your father's activities, they've been building a case with my complete cooperation and protection." The revelation hit the room like a seismic shock. This wasn't just a messy divorce playing out publicly, this was an active federal investigation, with criminal implications that went far beyond personal betrayal. Kirk staggered backward, grabbing the edge of a table for support. "You wore a wire," he whispered, the truth finally dawning on him. "All those conversations, all those times you asked me to explain the accounts. I documented everything. I confirmed. Every lie you told me about the offshore transfers, every false assurance about tax compliance, every threat you made when I started asking questions. The investigators have it all. The defeated look in Kirk's eyes was complete now. His final gambit had not only failed, it had exposed him to additional federal charges, while demonstrating the calculated nature of his fraud attempts. The really tragic part, I said softly, is that even now, facing complete exposure, you chose threats over honesty. You chose to try to destroy me, rather than take responsibility for your actions. Kirk slumped into a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands. Around the room, guests sat in stunned silence, processing the scope of what they had witnessed. The man they had known as a successful businessman had been revealed as a federal criminal who had been willing to threaten his own wife to avoid consequences. It was a fall from grace so complete that recovery seemed impossible. The weight of Kirk's complete defeat settled over the ballroom like a heavy curtain. He sat slumped in the chair, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from the confrontation. For the first time in our 23-year marriage, I was seeing him without any masks or pretenses, just a broken man who had gambled everything on manipulation and lost. Anthony stepped closer to the microphone, his voice gentle but firm. Dad, it doesn't have to end like this. Even now, you could choose to do the right thing. Kirk looked up at our son with eyes that seemed decades older than they had an hour ago. The right thing, he laughed bitterly. According to who? According to your mother, who's been plotting my destruction for months. According to the FBI agents who are probably listening to this conversation right now. According to basic human decency, Evie said quietly from beside Anthony. Her lawyer's training had taught her to recognize when someone was spiraling beyond rational thought. Mr. Watson, you still have choices. You can cooperate with investigators, make restitution where possible, and try to salvage some dignity from this situation. Dignity, Kirk repeated, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. That's rich, coming from the woman whose wedding I just destroyed with my own stupidity. I looked around the room at the shocked faces of our guests, friends, family members, business associates who had known Kirk for years. Their expressions ranged from disappointment to disgust, but I also saw something else in several faces, a kind of relieved understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. You didn't destroy the wedding, Dad, Anthony said, his voice carrying the patient tone he'd learned during his therapy years. You revealed who you really are. There's a difference. Margaret Lester stood up from her table, her movements deliberate and authoritative. Kirk, as someone who's watched you for 15 years, I need to say something. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Your business practices have been questionable for a long time. The expense irregularities, the unauthorized client entertainment, the way you treated junior staff, Charles and I have been documenting concerns for months. Charles Lester nodded reluctantly. We were planning to address it after the wedding season ended. We thought it was manageable, containable. We never imagined the scope was this extensive. The business dimension of Kirk's downfall was adding another layer of consequences. Even if he somehow avoided criminal prosecution, his professional reputation was destroyed beyond repair. No financial services firm would hire someone with his record of ethical violations and criminal exposure. 23 years, I said softly into the microphone, my voice carrying a weight of accumulated grief and disappointment. 23 years of making excuses for behavior I knew was wrong. Of protecting your reputation while you systematically undermined our family's foundation. I could feel tears threatening, but they weren't tears of sadness or regret. They were tears of relief, the kind that comes when a burden you've carried so long you forgot it was there, finally gets lifted from your shoulders. I stayed because I thought love meant accepting unacceptable treatment, I continued. I stayed because I believed that sacrifice without recognition was noble. I stayed because I was afraid of what independence might cost. Kirk raised his head to look at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the man I had married decades ago, before success had poisoned his character, before entitlement had replaced empathy, before he had forgotten that other people were human beings deserving of respect. But Anthony's depression taught me something important, I said, glancing at my son with infinite love and pride. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive behavior. Sometimes love means setting boundaries that force people to face consequences. Anthony's eyes filled with understanding. He remembered those difficult years when I had refused to let him retreat completely from the world, when I had insisted on therapy even when he resisted, when I had maintained hope for his recovery even when he had given up on himself. You enabled this, Kirk said suddenly, his voice sharp with renewed anger. You signed the papers, you never questioned the lifestyle, you enjoyed the benefits of everything I built. You're just as guilty as I am. The accusation hung in the air for a moment, before I responded with a calmness that surprised even me. You're right about one thing, I said. I am guilty of trusting someone who systematically betrayed that trust. Guilty of prioritizing peace over truth. Guilty of teaching my son that love means accepting abuse. I looked directly at Kirk, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in decades. But that guilt ends tonight. Along with everything else that's been broken beyond repair. The finality in my voice seemed to echo through the silent ballroom, marking the end of not just a marriage, but an entire era of accepting the unacceptable. The finality of my words seemed to drain the last remnants of fight from Kirk. He sat in that chair like a deflated balloon, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Around the room, guests began to shift uncomfortably, the drama reaching a conclusion that felt both inevitable and devastating. I need to leave, Kirk said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't sit here anymore. He stood slowly, his movements those of a much older man, as he straightened his wrinkled jacket and looked around the room one last time. I felt an unexpected wave of something that might have been pity. This was the father of my child, the man I had once loved enough to build a life with, and he was walking away from everything he had ever cared about. Dad, Anthony called out, taking a step toward his father. Wait. Kirk stopped, hope flickering briefly across his features. Anthony, I want you to know, my son said, his voice steady and clear, that I forgive you, not because what you did was acceptable, but because holding on to anger would only hurt me. You're still my father, and when you're ready to be honest about who you are and what you've done, I'll be here. The grace in Anthony's words brought tears to my eyes. My son had learned lessons about forgiveness and boundaries that had taken me decades to understand. He was offering his father a path to redemption, while refusing to enable his destructive behavior. Kirk's face crumpled, genuine emotion breaking through his defensive walls for the first time all evening. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words so quiet I barely heard them. I'm so sorry, son. I know, Anthony replied simply. But sorry isn't enough anymore. You need to make different choices. Kirk nodded, unable to speak. He turned toward the exit, pausing only when he reached the spot where I stood at the microphone. For a moment, we looked at each other without the layers of resentment and manipulation that had defined our relationship for so long. Harriet, he said quietly, I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know, the man you married 23 years ago really did love you. He just got lost somewhere along the way. I nodded, feeling the truth of those words, even as I recognized their inadequacy. I know, I replied. But love without respect, without honesty, without basic decency, that's not really love at all. It's just need dressed up in prettier clothes. Kirk's shoulders sagged as he absorbed the finality of my response. There would be no reconciliation, no last-minute forgiveness that would restore his comfortable life. The consequences of his choices had finally caught up with him. "Goodbye, Kirk," I said softly, and he walked out of the ballroom, out of our lives, and into an uncertain future that he had created entirely through his own actions. The silence that followed his exit was profound but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a storm finally passing, of tension finally releasing, of truth finally being acknowledged by everyone in the room. I looked around at our guests, at Charles and Margaret Lester, who would need to rebuild their firm's reputation, at Anthony's college friends, who had witnessed a masterclass in standing up for yourself, at the various family members and acquaintances who had seen what happens when someone finally stops accepting unacceptable treatment. "Well," I said, into the microphone, allowing a small smile to cross my face, "that wasn't exactly the best man speech I had planned." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, the tension beginning to break as people processed what they had witnessed. Anthony moved to my side, wrapping his arm around my shoulders in a gesture of support and solidarity. "Actually, Mom," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think it was exactly the speech this moment needed. Sometimes the truth is more important than tradition." Evie joined us, her face glowing with admiration and respect. "Mrs. Watson, Harriet, that was one of the most courageous things I've ever witnessed. Thank you for showing us what real strength looks like." Margaret Lester stood and began to applaud, slowly and deliberately. One by one, other guests joined her until the entire room was filled with the sound of appreciation for a woman who had finally chosen herself over the comfort of others. As the applause continued, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine pride in my own actions, satisfaction with choices I had made for my own well-being, rather than everyone else's comfort. For the first time in decades, I was free to be exactly who I was without apology or explanation. The wedding reception could continue now, but it would be different from what anyone had planned. It would be a celebration not just of Anthony and Evie's love, but of the truth that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's self-destruction. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer constrained by the weight of someone else's lies. The applause gradually faded, leaving behind a different kind of energy in the ballroom. Where there had been tension and shock, now there was something lighter, relief perhaps, or the collective exhale of people who had witnessed justice being served. The wedding reception could finally begin in earnest, but it would be unlike any celebration these guests had ever attended. Anthony took the microphone from my hands, his face radiant with pride and determination. "I know this evening hasn't gone according to plan," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "But in a way it's been perfect, because the woman standing beside me, my mother, my best mate, my hero, has just shown all of us what courage really looks like." He turned to look at me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mom, you've spent my entire life protecting me, supporting me, and teaching me how to be strong. Tonight, you protected yourself, and in doing so, you've given me the greatest wedding gift I could ever receive: the knowledge that my mother will never again accept being treated as less than she deserves." The emotion in his voice was overwhelming. I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly as I tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. For 23 years, I had defined myself through my relationships to others: Kirk's wife, Anthony's mother, the supportive woman behind successful men. Tonight, for the first time, I had stood up purely as myself. Evie stepped forward, taking the microphone with the poise of someone accustomed to addressing courtrooms. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been an attorney for 8 years, and I've seen a lot of people stand up for justice in my courtroom. But I've never seen anyone deliver truth with more grace and dignity than Harriet just did. She looked directly at me, her expression warm with genuine affection. When Anthony told me he wanted his mother as his best mate, I thought it was sweet but unconventional. Now I understand it was prophetic. You really are the best man any of us know. Laughter rippled through the crowd, genuine warm laughter that felt like sunshine after a thunderstorm. The guests were beginning to relax, to process what they had witnessed, and to recognize that they had been present for something extraordinary.
I think, Evie continued, that we should proceed with this reception exactly as Anthony and I planned it, as a celebration of love, truth, and the courage to build something beautiful, even when the foundation has been shaken. Margaret Lester stood up from her table, raising her champagne glass. To Harriet Watson, she called out, her voice carrying the authority of her 70 years. For showing us that it's never too late to choose yourself. To Harriet, the room echoed, glasses rising throughout the ballroom. The toast was spontaneous, heartfelt, and completely unplanned, which somehow made it more meaningful than any scripted celebration could have been. As I looked around the room at the faces of people who had witnessed my lowest and highest moments in the same evening, I felt a profound sense of completion. The woman who had walked into this ballroom 3 hours ago, nervous, uncertain, still carrying the weight of secrets and shame, no longer existed. In her place stood someone I was only beginning to know, a person capable of protecting herself, of demanding respect, of choosing truth over comfort. Anthony reclaimed the microphone, his smile bright enough to illuminate the entire room. Since my mother has already given the most memorable speech in wedding history, I think we can skip the traditional best man remarks and move straight to the dancing. After all, we have a lot to celebrate. The DJ, who had been frozen in place during the entire confrontation, suddenly sprang back to life, cueing up the first dance music. Anthony offered me his arm with exaggerated gallantry. "Mom, would you do me the honor of the first dance? I believe it's traditional for the best man to dance with the groom." I laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in months. "I think you're making that up, but I accept anyway." As we moved onto the dance floor, other couples began to join us. Charles and Margaret Lester, several of Anthony's college friends with their partners, even some of Kirk's former business associates, who had apparently decided that celebrating truth was more important than maintaining uncomfortable loyalties. The music was soft and romantic, meant for newlyweds, but somehow perfect for this moment of rebirth and new beginnings. As Anthony spun me gently around the floor, I caught glimpses of the guests' faces, no longer shocked or uncomfortable, but genuinely happy to be celebrating something real and meaningful. "Thank you," Anthony whispered as we danced, "for showing me what it looks like to refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, for teaching me that love and respect go together, for being exactly who you are." I looked into my son's eyes, clear, confident, whole, and realized that everything I had sacrificed, everything I had endured, had been worth it for this moment. Not because of Kirk's downfall, but because Anthony would never have to learn the hard way that love without respect is just another form of abuse. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time in decades, I was free to explore it on my own terms. The dance floor filled with couples as the evening transformed from catastrophe into celebration. I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and quiet words of support from guests who had witnessed my metamorphosis. Several women pulled me aside to share their own stories of difficult marriages and small rebellions, their voices hushed but their eyes bright with vicarious pride. "I wish I'd had your courage 20 years ago," whispered Patricia Coleman, Charles's sister-in-law, whose husband had been noticeably absent from conversations all evening. "Maybe I wouldn't still be making excuses for behavior I know is wrong." Her words stayed with me as I circulated through the reception,
watching Anthony and Evie glow with happiness that felt more authentic now that the pretense was gone. Their joy wasn't shadowed by the need to maintain appearances or navigate family tensions. They were free to simply be themselves, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about their future. Near the gift table, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Anthony's former therapist, who had been invited to the wedding in recognition of her role in his recovery. She had watched the entire confrontation with professional interest, her trained eye observing dynamics that others might have missed. "Harriet," she said quietly, "what you did tonight required incredible emotional strength. The ability to remain calm while standing up for yourself, to speak truth without cruelty, that's not easy even under the best circumstances." "I had good teachers," I replied, glancing toward Anthony, who was laughing with his college friends near the bar. Watching my son learn to set boundaries during his recovery taught me that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Dr. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. Codependency often masquerades as love, especially in families dealing with addiction, mental health issues, or in your case, systematic emotional abuse. Breaking those patterns takes tremendous insight and courage. Her clinical validation meant more to me than I expected. For years I had questioned my own perceptions, wondered if I was being too sensitive or demanding too much. Tonight had proven that my instincts had been correct all along, that Kirk's treatment of our family had been unacceptable, and that my tolerance of it had been enabling rather than loving. As the evening progressed, I noticed several interesting developments around the room. Charles Lester was having intense whispered conversations with other business associates, clearly beginning the damage control process that would be necessary to salvage Coleman and Associates' reputation. Margaret sat beside him, occasionally offering input with the authority of someone who understood both the legal and social implications of the scandal. At another table, some of Kirk's former golf buddies were conspicuously absent from conversations, their wives shooting meaningful glances in my direction. The social circles that had once revolved around Kirk's apparent success were already reorganizing themselves around the new reality of his disgrace. Most remarkably, Anthony's friends had seamlessly absorbed the evening's drama without letting it diminish their celebration of his marriage. They surrounded him and Evie with protective affection, creating a bubble of normalcy that allowed the couple to focus on their joy, rather than the chaos that had preceded it. Mrs. Watson, a young woman, approached me hesitantly. "Jessica, one of Evie's law school classmates. I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to thank you for what you did tonight." She glanced around nervously before continuing. "My father has been financially and emotionally abusive to my mother for 15 years. She's always said she stays for the children, but we've been adults for years now, watching you stand up for yourself. Maybe it will give her permission to do the same." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the microphone crackling to life. Anthony stood at the front of the room, his arm around Evie's waist, both of them radiant with happiness. "Everyone, can I have your attention for just a moment?" he called out, waiting for the conversations to quiet. "Evie and I want to thank you all for being here tonight, for celebrating with us, and for witnessing something truly extraordinary." He looked directly at me, his expression serious but warm. "This evening didn't go according to plan, but it went exactly as it needed to. We got to see what real love looks like, not the kind that demands sacrifice without recognition, but the kind that insists on truth, respect, and dignity." Evie took the microphone, her lawyer's training evident in her poise. "In my profession, I see the aftermath of relationships built on deception and control. What Harriet showed us tonight is how to break those cycles before they destroy another generation." She raised her champagne glass toward me. "To my new mother-in-law, who taught us that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's lies." The toast that followed was different from the earlier spontaneous celebration. This one was deliberate, thoughtful, acknowledging not just my courage but the broader implications of choosing truth over comfort. As glasses clinked around the room, I realized that this wedding reception had become something none of us had expected. A celebration of liberation, a testament to the power of finally saying enough, and a promise that the next generation would build relationships on firmer foundations. The evening that had begun with betrayal was ending with hope. As the evening wound toward its natural conclusion, guests began the familiar ritual of collecting coats and purses, exchanging final embraces, and offering heartfelt congratulations to the newlyweds. But this wasn't the typical post-wedding departure where people made polite promises to stay in touch. Tonight felt different, charged with the energy of shared witnessing, of being present for something that would be remembered and retold for years to come. Anthony and Evie stood near the exit, thanking guests with the gracious exhaustion of a couple who had experienced more emotional intensity in one evening than most people encounter in months. I watched from across the room as person after person stopped to speak with them, their faces animated with the kind of genuine connection that emerges when pretense has been stripped away. Margaret Lester approached me with her coat folded over her arm, her expression thoughtful. "Harriet, I've been thinking about what happens next. The legal proceedings, the business implications, it's going to be complicated." I nodded, understanding that the euphoria of tonight's revelations would soon give way to the practical realities of divorce, criminal investigations, and rebuilding a life that had been intertwined with Kirk's for over 2 decades. "I have a recommendation," Margaret continued. "Elena Rodriguez, she's the best family law attorney in Chicago, specializes in high-asset divorces with criminal complications. More importantly, she understands the emotional dynamics of cases like yours." She pressed a business card into my hand. "Tell her I sent you. She'll make sure Kirk's legal team doesn't try to intimidate you into a settlement that doesn't reflect what you've endured." The practical support was unexpected and deeply appreciated. For so many years, I had handled crises alone. Anthony's depression, financial problems, social difficulties, always managing, always making do. The idea of having professional advocates felt almost foreign. Charles Lester joined us, his face showing the strain of the evening's revelations. "Harriet, I owe you an apology. Margaret and I suspected something was wrong with Kirk's activities, but we should have acted sooner. We let our business relationship cloud our judgment about his character. His honesty was refreshing after years of Kirk's defensive deflections. Charles, you're not responsible for your partner's choices. None of us saw the full scope of what he was hiding." "Still," he replied, "Coleman and Associates will be conducting a complete forensic audit of all accounts and transactions. Whatever we discover, we'll make sure it's shared with investigators and that any stolen funds are returned where possible." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had been waiting nearby. "Harriet, I wanted to offer some resources before I leave. The transition you're facing, from a long-term marriage with these dynamics to complete independence, can be more challenging than people expect." She handed me a small card with several phone numbers. Support groups for women leaving financially abusive relationships, a therapist who specializes in post-divorce recovery, and my direct number if you need professional guidance during the legal proceedings. The practical support kept coming, each offer a reminder that I wouldn't have to navigate this new reality entirely alone. After decades of managing everything myself, the idea of accepting help felt both foreign and necessary. Anthony approached our small group, his tie loosened and his face showing the happy exhaustion of a groom at the end of his wedding day. "Mom, can we talk for a minute?" We found a quiet corner near the large windows overlooking the city, the lights of Chicago sparkling below us, like scattered jewels. Anthony took my hands in his his expression serious but peaceful. "I need you to know," he said quietly, "that what you did tonight wasn't just about standing up to Dad. It was about showing me what kind of marriage I never want to have, what kind of father I never want to be." His words carried the weight of generational change, of cycles being consciously broken rather than unconsciously repeated. Evie and I talked about it during the last dance. We want to build something completely different, a partnership based on respect, honesty, and genuine equality. "That's all I ever wanted for you," I replied, feeling tears threaten again. "The chance to choose love that builds you up instead of wearing you down." "I know," he said, squeezing my hands gently, "and now you have that chance too. For the first time in decades, you get to discover who you are when you're not managing someone else's chaos or protecting someone else's reputation." The truth of his observation was both exhilarating and terrifying. At 52, I was about to embark on a journey of self-discovery that most people begin in their 20s. The woman who had defined herself through service to others would need to learn who she was when she was simply herself. "Are you scared?" Anthony asked, reading my expression with the intuition that had always connected us. "Terrified," I admitted, "but also excited. For the first time in my adult life, I get to make choices based on what I want, rather than what everyone else needs." Anthony smiled, the same warm expression that had sustained me through his darkest years. "Mom, you're going to be amazing. And whatever you choose, wherever you go, you'll always have Evie and me in your corner." As we rejoined the final guests, saying their goodbyes, I felt the weight of possibility settling around me like a comfortable cloak. The future was unwritten, uncertain, and entirely mine to create. The last guests departed near midnight, leaving Anthony, Evie and me alone, in the grand ballroom with the catering staff, efficiently dismantling the remnants of what had become the most memorable wedding reception in Chicago social history. Crystal glasses clinked softly as they were packed away, and the elaborate floral arrangements were being carefully wrapped for the newlyweds to take home. We sat together at the head table, our formal shoes kicked off under tablecloths, sharing a quiet moment that felt both exhausted and exhilarated. The adrenaline of the evening's confrontations was finally wearing off, leaving behind a profound sense of completion mixed with uncertainty about what came next. "I can't believe it's over," Evie said softly, her wedding dress spread around her like a cloud of silk and lace. "Not the wedding, that was perfect, but the whole situation with your father, the years of tension, the walking on eggshells, it actually feels over." Anthony nodded, loosening his bow tie completely. "I keep expecting Dad to call, or show up, or find some way to make this about him. It's going to take time to believe that he's really gone from our lives." The absence of Kirk's presence was palpable, not just his physical departure, but the psychological space that had been occupied by his demands, his moods, his need to be the center of attention. For the first time in years, we were having a family conversation without calculating how our words might be twisted or used against us later. "What happens now?" I asked, the question hanging in the air like incense. "I mean practically, legally, emotionally." Evie's lawyer instincts kicked in, her voice taking on the organized tone she used for complex cases. "First, you'll need to secure your own legal representation, someone completely separate from Kirk's interests. The criminal investigation will proceed independently, but the divorce proceedings need to protect your assets and establish clear boundaries." She paused, considering the implications. "Given the federal investigation and the evidence you've already provided, Kirk will likely be advised to avoid any contact with you except through attorneys. That should give you space to process everything without additional manipulation or pressure." The idea of silence from Kirk, no phone calls demanding explanations, no surprise visits to work things out, No carefully crafted emails designed to make me doubt my own perceptions. Felt like the promise of peace after decades of low-level warfare. Anthony reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Mom, I want you to know that you have options. Real options. The guest house behind our new place is completely private. If you need somewhere to stay while you figure things out, or if you want to travel, or move somewhere completely different, we'll support whatever you choose. The generosity of his offer touched me deeply, but I realized I didn't want to jump from dependence on Kirk to dependence on my son, no matter how loving his intentions. The work of discovering who I was as an independent person needed to happen on my own terms. Thank you, sweetheart, but I think I need to figure out what independence actually looks like, I said. I've been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's employee for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to be just myself. A comfortable silence settled over us as we processed the magnitude of the changes ahead. The ballroom around us was nearly empty now, the elaborate wedding decorations reduced to neat stacks of supplies and folded linens. It felt symbolic, the formal structures being dismantled to reveal the fundamental relationships underneath. There's something I want to tell you both, I said, feeling the weight of a decision that had been forming throughout the evening. I'm going to use some of the settlement money to go back to school. Anthony's eyes widened with surprise and delight. Mom, that's incredible. What do you want to study? Psychology, I replied, the word feeling both foreign and familiar on my tongue. Specifically, I want to work with women and families dealing with emotional abuse and financial manipulation. Tonight showed me how much knowledge I've gained about these dynamics, and I want to use it to help other people recognize and escape similar situations. Evie clasped her hands together, her face lighting up with professional excitement. Harriet, that's brilliant. Your lived experience combined with formal training, you could make such a difference for people who are where you were 5 years ago. The vision was taking shape in my mind. Graduate school, internships, eventually a practice focused on helping people navigate the complex intersection of emotional abuse and financial entanglement. It would be challenging, starting a new career at 52, but for the first time in decades, I was choosing something based purely on my own interests and values. It won't be easy, I acknowledged, but nothing worthwhile ever is. Anthony stood up and moved around the table to embrace me, his hug carrying all the pride and support I could have hoped for. Mom, you're going to change people's lives, including your own. As we finally gathered our belongings and prepared to leave the ballroom, I took one last look around the space where my old life had ended, and my new one had begun. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and investigations, paperwork and difficult conversations. But tonight, for the first time in 23 years, I was free. 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of my new apartment in Lincoln Park, watching the morning sun stream through windows that I had chosen, in a space that belonged entirely to me. The one-bedroom unit was modest by the standards of the life I'd shared with Kirk, but every piece of furniture, every book on the shelves, every photograph on the walls reflected my own taste and values, rather than someone else's vision of who I should be. The divorce had proceeded with surprising efficiency once Kirk's legal team realized the futility of fighting federal charges, while simultaneously battling a divorce case built on documented fraud. His cooperation with investigators had earned him a reduced sentence, 18 months in minimum security prison followed by 3 years of supervised probation, but it had also required him to forfeit most of his assets to pay restitution and fines. The Watson Family Trust had been fully restored to my control, providing financial security I had never truly possessed during my marriage. More importantly, the legal proceedings had validated years of gaslighting and manipulation, officially recognizing that I had been the victim of systematic financial abuse rather than a willing participant in illegal activities. My phone buzzed with a text from Anthony. Coffee before your first class. I'm buying to celebrate my mom becoming a graduate student. I smiled, still adjusting to the reality that at 52 I was enrolled in Northwestern University's Master of Social Work program, specializing in trauma recovery and family systems. The other students in my cohort were primarily in their 20s and 30s, but my life experience gave me perspectives that complemented their theoretical knowledge in ways that benefited everyone. The program was rigorous and challenging, requiring me to examine not just academic concepts but my own psychological patterns and coping mechanisms. In therapy supervision sessions, I was learning to distinguish between healthy caretaking and codependent enabling, between genuine love and trauma bonding, between supporting someone's growth and managing their emotions for them. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had become both a professional mentor and personal therapist, helping me navigate the disorienting transition from defined identity to open possibility. Recovery from long-term emotional abuse, she had explained during one of our sessions, isn't just about leaving the abusive situation. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that were suppressed or abandoned in service of someone else's dysfunction. That process of reclamation was ongoing and sometimes painful. Simple decisions: what to eat for dinner, how to spend a Saturday afternoon, whether to accept a social invitation, required conscious thought after decades of automatically deferring to Kirk's preferences and schedules. But each choice was also an act of self-discovery, a small declaration of independence that gradually built confidence in my own judgment and desires. The doorbell rang, interrupting my morning reflection. Through the peephole, I saw Margaret Lester holding a coffee tray and what appeared to be legal documents. "Margaret, what brings you by so early?" I asked, letting her into my sunny living room. "Good news," she said, settling into the armchair I'd splurged on from a local furniture maker. "Charles wanted me to deliver this personally." She handed me an envelope bearing the Coleman and Associates letterhead. Inside was a check for $47,000, the final restitution payment from the firm's insurance settlement covering Kirk's embezzled expenses. "This closes out the last of the financial irregularities," Margaret explained. "Charles also wanted me to tell you that the firm's reputation has actually recovered stronger than before. Clients respect the way you and he handled the situation, prioritizing integrity over convenience. The money was significant, but the validation mattered more. For months I had wondered whether my public confrontation had been unnecessarily dramatic, whether I could have handled the situation more privately. Margaret's words confirmed that truth-telling, even when uncomfortable, ultimately served everyone's best interests. "There's something else," Margaret continued, her expression shifting to something more personal. "I've been talking with several other women in our social circle, wives of successful men who've been dealing with similar issues. Financial control, emotional manipulation, the gradual erosion of their independent identity." She leaned forward, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who had witnessed transformation and wanted to share it. "They're asking if you'd be willing to speak with them. Not as a therapist, you're not qualified yet, but as someone who found a way out, someone who proved that it's never too late to choose yourself." The request both honored and challenged me. 6 months ago, I would have deflected such a responsibility, insisting that I wasn't qualified to help anyone else when my own life was in chaos. But my social work training was teaching me that healing often happens in community, that sharing our stories can be both personally therapeutic and socially transformative. "I'd be honored," I replied, "but I think we should include professional support. Maybe Dr. Mitchell could help us structure something useful, rather than just cathartic." Margaret smiled with genuine warmth. "I was hoping you'd say that. Charles and I have been discussing funding a support group for women dealing with financial abuse. Would you consider facilitating it once you complete your degree? The offer represented everything I had hoped education might lead to: meaningful work that merged personal experience with professional expertise, the chance to transform my own pain into a resource for others facing similar challenges. Looking around my small, carefully chosen apartment, I realized I had created something Kirk could never have given me: a life built on my own terms, sustained by my own choices, and dedicated to purposes that reflected my deepest values. The future stretched ahead, no longer constrained by someone else's limitations but expanded by my own possibilities. 2 years later, I stood at the podium in the auditorium of Northwestern University's School of Social Work, looking out at an audience of graduate students, faculty members, and community advocates who had gathered for the annual symposium on domestic violence prevention. My hands were steady as I adjusted the microphone, a far cry from the trembling woman who had once struggled to speak up in her own home. "Good evening," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. "My name is Dr. Harriet Watson, and I'm here tonight to talk about the intersection of financial abuse and emotional manipulation in intimate relationships, not just as an academic researcher, but as someone who lived that reality for over 2 decades." The audience was attentive, a mix of professionals who worked with abuse survivors and students preparing to enter the field. In the front row, I spotted Anthony and Evie, their faces glowing with pride. Next to them sat Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Margaret Lester, and several women from the support group we had established 18 months earlier. 2 years ago, I delivered a very different kind of speech, I continued, allowing myself a small smile. It was at my son's wedding reception, and it began the most terrifying and liberating period of my life. Tonight, I want to share what I've learned about the journey from victimization to empowerment, from silence to advocacy. I clicked the first slide of my presentation, displaying statistics about financial abuse that would have seemed abstract to me just a few years earlier. Now they represented real faces, real stories of women I had worked with through our support group and my clinical training. Financial abuse affects approximately 99% of domestic violence cases, yet it remains one of the least understood and most underreported forms of intimate partner violence, I explained. It's invisible to outsiders, difficult to prove legally, and creates barriers to leaving that can trap victims for decades. As I moved through the presentation, sharing research findings alongside personal insights, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from transforming pain into purpose. My master's thesis had examined the long-term psychological effects of financial manipulation on women's self-efficacy and decision-making capabilities. The research had been personally healing while contributing to academic understanding of these complex dynamics. The support group we established here in Chicago has served over 40 women in the past 18 months, I said, clicking to a slide showing anonymized outcome data. What we've learned is that recovery requires not just emotional support, but practical education about financial independence, legal rights, and career development. In the audience, I saw Sandra Rodriguez nod approvingly. She was one of our first group members, a former teacher who had left her financially abusive husband after attending our sessions for 6 months. Now she was completing her own master's degree in counseling, planning to specialize in trauma recovery. But tonight, I want to focus on something even more fundamental than statistics or program outcomes, I said, moving away from the podium to speak more directly to the audience. I want to talk about the moment when you stop asking, "How did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What am I going to do about it?" The auditorium was completely silent, the kind of focused attention that indicated people were connecting personally with the material rather than just processing it intellectually. For 23 years, I defined myself through my relationships to others. I was Kirk's wife, Anthony's mother, the woman who managed everyone else's comfort while abandoning my own needs and desires. I told myself this was love, sacrifice, maturity. What I was actually doing was enabling dysfunction while slowly erasing myself. I paused, making eye contact with individual audience members, seeing recognition in several faces. The night I finally spoke my truth publicly, I wasn't just exposing my husband's crimes. I was reclaiming my right to exist as a complete person rather than a supporting character in someone else's story. And that reclamation, that's where real empowerment begins. As I concluded the formal presentation and opened the floor for questions, the responses revealed how universal these experiences were. A graduate student shared her mother's similar situation. A faculty member discussed the financial abuse her sister had endured. A community advocate asked about developing similar programs in rural areas where resources were limited. Each question, each story shared, reinforced my conviction that this work was exactly where I belonged. The woman who had once been afraid to contradict her husband was now leading conversations about social change, policy development, and systemic intervention. After the event, as I packed up my materials and said goodbye to colleagues and friends, Anthony approached with tears in his eyes. "Mom, I am so proud of who you've become," he said, embracing me tightly. "Not just tonight but every day for the past 2 years. You've shown me what it looks like to rebuild your life from the ground up." "I've shown myself," I replied, feeling the truth of those words deeply. And that's been the most important lesson of all. As I drove home through the Chicago streets I had learned to navigate independently, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who had once measured her worth by her ability to manage other people's emotions now found fulfillment in helping others recognize their own strength and value. If you're listening to this story and recognizing parts of your own experience, I want you to know something important. The voice in your head that whispers you're not strong enough, not smart enough, not worthy enough to demand better treatment, that voice is lying. You have more power than you realize, more options than you can currently see, and more support available than you might imagine. Empowerment isn't a destination you arrive at suddenly. It's a practice, a daily choice to honor your own needs and boundaries. It starts with small acts of self-respect and grows into the courage to transform not just your own life, but the lives of others who need to hear that change is possible. You deserve relationships built on respect rather than control, love rather than obligation, truth rather than manipulation. And you have the strength to create that reality, one brave choice at a time. The journey from victimization to empowerment isn't easy, but it's worth every difficult step. Your voice matters, your truth matters, you matter. And it's never too late to choose yourself.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.